All right. Hello, everybody. And by my clock, it is now 4:30 Eastern Time, Eastern U.S. time. And I want to welcome everybody to our Restorative Justice webinar today. We're going to talk about the cultivation of public compassion. And our guest today is Dr. Chris Marshall. And I'll let Howard do a fuller introduction of Chris here in a moment. But I'll just give myself a very quick introduction and then also talk a little bit about how you as participants can interact with us throughout the course of this webinar. First of all, my name is Brian Gum, and I'm the Distance Learning Technology Analyst for Eastern Mennonite University, and I help facilitate the technology for the Restorative Justice webinar series, which we're now in our second year of these. And it's been a lot of fun for me because I'm not only the tech guy who helps run this stuff, I'm also a former student of Howard's. I'm a recent graduate of the Center for Justice and Peace Building, and my emphasis was in restorative justice. I'm also particularly excited for our event today because I have been a follower of some of Dr. Chris Marshall's work. I most recently read his book that we're going to probably talk a little bit about today, which is Compassionate Justice, which I have happily sitting on my bookshelf back there. And so I have an interest personally in restorative justice and theology, and so that's something that Chris also works with. So I'm excited for today. Now I'll talk just a little bit about the technology. Now participants in the webinar will not be able to speak or have their video on like we are as the panelists, but you can make text chat. You can have text chat down in the bottom right corner of the WebEx window. And the way we're going to do this is so that you can kind of lodge questions during the course of the next hour and a half. Please direct those messages to Sarah Roth Shank, right below or right above the area where you type in your text chat message. There's the option to select who you send that text chat to. And Sarah Roth Shank is sitting in Howard's office with Howard, so she's going to be monitoring that text chat feed and kind of handing over those questions that come to her, to Howard. And then Howard's going to periodically inject those questions into the discussion itself. So that's the way that we can elicit some kind of participation from you all attending, which we definitely want to hear your questions and your feedback over the course of the webinar. So again, please just send those text chat comments or questions to Sarah Roth Shank. If they accidentally go to me, I can easily forward them on to Sarah, so don't worry too much about it. But that's how that will work. And now I will stop talking and turn my camera on and turn things over to Howard. Howard, you want to get things rolling?
Sure. And welcome to everyone. It's this afternoon. It is afternoon here in Virginia at any rate. It's different times for some of you. I, too, am excited about this topic and to have my friend Chris Marshall on. Chris will be speaking to us from Wellington, New Zealand. And his topic is an important one, I think. It has to do with the role of restorative justice in the public domain and specifically the role of compassion in restorative justice. And that has been a somewhat controversial topic. You know, that restorative justice depends on compassion. Certainly it encourages us. But what is the role of compassion in all this? Chris's team, are we okay in the volume? I'm hearing some racket in here. We're all right, Brian?
You should probably be okay. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Well, Chris is not only a biblical scholar, but a longtime restorative justice activist and theorist. And his work has been causing some real rethinking of how we interpret the New Testament. But it's also, his work serves as a starting point for exploring restorative justice in the secular world as well. I don't know how explicitly biblical his theme will be here today, but I always think of Herman Bianchi, the law professor from Holland that influenced me in the early days, that he always used to argue from homeopathic theory. You know, homeopathic theory argues that to get rid of whatever ails us, we need a little bit of the same thing. And Bianchi always argued that Western theology, or particular interpretation of theology, got us into this mess and helped to get us in the mess. It's going to take a little theology to get us out of it. Well, let me give you a few highlights from Chris's background. He's currently head of the School of Art History, Classic, and Religious Studies at Victoria University of Wellington in New Zealand. He's been there for a while. But I'm very excited. He's been recently appointed to Professor of Restorative Justice in what is going to be a new Restorative Justice Center at the School of Government in Victoria University of Wellington. It's going to be an important center, I think, for restorative justice work in New Zealand. As I said, he's a longtime restorative justice practitioner and theorist, and a leading figure in what some of us call restorative theology. His books that I think are particularly relevant to this audience include Beyond Retribution, a New Testament Vision of Justice, a book that has gained a great deal of attention because of its fresh look at the New Testament. His book, a smaller book that's not as well known, it says crowed with, sorry, a little misspelling there, crowned with glory and honor, Human Rights in the Biblical Tradition. It's an important exploration of the human rights tradition and its resonance with the biblical tradition. A little book of biblical justice in the series that I edit, and then the one we're talking about today, Compassionate Justice. So, Chris, I'm going to turn it over to you, and you can take charge of the PowerPoint at this point.
Okay, so am I coming through okay? You can hear me all right, Howard?
Mm-hmm. You are.
All right, well, greetings to everybody. It's Wednesday morning down here in New Zealand. These time differences are always a bit confusing. I logged in at this time yesterday, not realizing or not understanding that Tuesday your time, Wednesday your time was Thursday our time. So it's actually Thursday morning here on a very blustery spring morning. But I'm delighted to have this chance to do my first ever webinar. A little intimidated by the technology and by speaking from my computer screen rather than to a live class, but I'm privileged really to be given this opportunity. So thanks to the people who have chosen to participate. I understand that the slides don't go through line by line, so I'm afraid we're going to have to just put the whole lot up. But I thought I'd do three things in the time that I have to speak. I talk a little briefly, a little bit about my own background and experience in restorative justice, so you know where I'm coming from. Then I would like to just outline the kind of academic work that I've been doing over the last couple of decades in developing what is, as Howard mentioned, sometimes now called restorative theology. And then thirdly, to recount the journey of discovery, really, as it was for me in writing my most recent book, Compassionate Justice, which came out in August last year, and try and summarize the kind of theme that I developed but really discovered in doing that work. So just a little bit about myself. After completing my first degree and training and working briefly as a secondary school teacher, I decided to launch into theological studies. I did so by extension. So I worked on my own from home, doing a divinity degree by extension. After that, I was accepted for doctoral studies in New Testament at King's College at the University of London in England, and my wife and I travelled over there in 1981. During that time, we became members of the London Mennonite Fellowship, which was, I think, really a life-changing experience for us, and in many ways has set our lives and certainly set my work on a different track. There are no Mennonites or Anabaptist congregations deep down here in the South Pacific. We sought out this connection from having read key works by Yoda and others, And then when we arrived in London and discovered that there was a small fellowship there, we joined up with them, and that really was a very significant number of years. And I think it was during that time I first heard the name Howard Zehr, but I didn't meet him or learn anything about his work. We returned home to New Zealand in 1986, where I took up a lectureship in New Testament at a theological college in Auckland. And then after my first 5 years of teaching, I was due for a period of sabbatical leave, and we decided to take that back in the US, and to go to the Associated Mennonite Biblical Seminary in Elkhart in Indiana, AMBS, which I'm sure many of you will know of. Rather than spending that time doing my own research, which I should have done as a scholar on sabbatical, I enrolled in courses in peace studies and in Anabaptist history and theology, wanting to make the most of what the seminary had to offer that wasn't available to me back here in New Zealand. It was during the time of sabbatical in the US that I was given as a free gift Howard's book, Changing Lenses. I have a very vivid memory of the time in which this was handed to me, with a whole list of other documents that the person thought I'd be interested in, and you never turn down a free book. I put it aside to read at a later point because I was very busy with my own study at AMBS, and really didn't get around to reading the book until I returned home the following year. During our time at AMBS, my wife Margaret, who's a trained lawyer, but not a criminal lawyer, but as a trained lawyer, did a VORP course at the is it called the Centre for Community Justice in Elkhart, I think is the name. So anyway, she got involved first of all in the practice of restorative justice by doing that course. We returned home to New Zealand in 1992. I read Howard's book, really because I was interested in the chapter in it entitled, I think it's entitled Covenant Justice, a chapter on biblical justice, which is what interested me more than the discussion on criminal justice themes. But I read the whole book and was very, very impressed by it, very deeply affected by the book. And I wrote a lengthy review of the book, which was published in a local Christian journal. And the publishers decided that along with the review, they would solicit reactions to the review, and I guess to the book, from a judge, from prison chaplains, from lawyers. And so it became a kind of major entry in this issue of the journal. There was a good deal of interest in the review from readers. I was unaware at that time that New Zealand had, a few years earlier, pioneered the use of family group conferencing in its juvenile justice system. In 1989, New Zealand had done a complete overhaul of its juvenile justice realm and had introduced this notion of the family group conference. I mean, I was completely unaware of this. That overhaul of the legislation did not use restorative justice language, and I'm not even sure whether the architects of that legislation were aware of what was going on in North America at the time, but they ended up coming up with a restorative justice mechanism. I was also unaware that a number of community groups in the country were experimenting with the principles of family group conferencing, taking them out of the juvenile jurisdiction and applying them in the adult jurisdiction. And we're doing, again, some experimental work around restorative justice in the adult sphere. Again, I don't know whether those people were aware of what was going on in the US, whether they had read Howard's work or other work, but it was happening in the background and I was unaware of it. That helped to explain the groundswell of interest in my review of Changing Lenses. So much so that the publishers of the journal decided that they would convene a conference in New Zealand and invite Howard to come over as the keynote speaker. And I think from memory, that was in 1994. I was asked to present a paper at the conference that was held here in Wellington, that Howard spoke at, on what the New Testament had to say about crime and punishment. And again, it's one of those memories that's lodged very deeply in my mind, because I can quite vividly remember thinking when I received the invitation to present this paper that it wouldn't really take me much work to write this paper because, as far as I knew, the New Testament didn't have very much at all to say about crime and justice issues or about criminal punishment issues. Certainly, it spoke a lot about sin and about salvation. Yes, it spoke about social justice, and I had come to appreciate that it spoke a great deal about violence and peacemaking. But I wasn't instantly aware when I was asked to present this paper on anything it really had to say about crime or criminal offending. However, I discovered otherwise, because when I began working on that paper, I ended up becoming aware of a whole wealth of material in the New Testament. A lot of it sort of incidental, but nonetheless there. And a lot of other material that would be very familiar to New Testament scholars, which, when you thought about it carefully enough, had implications for criminal justice areas. So the paper that I presented at that paper really became the germ of my 2001 book, Beyond Retribution, a New Testament vision for justice, crime, and punishment. It began with that paper, and it grew into something a bit more substantial. Having worked on the theory and the theology to some extent of restorative justice, the opportunity emerged in the late 1990s for me to train as a restorative justice facilitator for a privately funded restorative justice program in West Auckland, where I lived. And a year or two later, after that, I was involved in a 4-year-long government-funded restorative justice pilot that was run out of 4 district courts around the country. One of which was again in the part of the city where my wife and I lived and worked. And so we became involved in founding and leading a restorative justice provider group, a community group of some 12 or 15 trained voluntary facilitators who provided the facilitation service to the local court that was involved in this pilot. That really was a wonderful experience, those 4 or 5 years. Both the experience of being involved in dozens and dozens and dozens of restorative justice conferences and getting exposure to the practice of restorative justice, but also the experience of forging practice standards that were appropriate to what we were trying to do. Then I moved in 2005 to a new job at the university here in Wellington. I have continued to be involved in facilitation, although not as often as before. But as Howard mentioned, I am soon to take up a new post, a very exciting development where the university has agreed to create a dedicated chair in restorative justice, and quite a lot of public funding from government departments has been made available for that. So I get the feeling that restorative justice in this country is poised for a second great leap forward. And that leap forward is partly being facilitated by even a conservative government. We have a centre-right government, but being facilitated by a commitment on the part of the state to promote restorative justice options within the criminal justice system. And I think this chair that we have created here at the university will be important in helping to resource this new work with more thorough teaching and research. So that's my background. More briefly, let me give you an overview of the kind of academic work that I've been doing over the last couple of decades. Most of my published work in the restorative justice field has been concerned with exploring the biblical and theological foundations, and I guess the moral foundations from a theological perspective of restorative justice. These days, I guess one of the debates in the restorative justice community is what the roots of the movement are, and there are lots of different roots that are claimed for it. I think probably it's better to think of a sort of fibrous root system rather than there being a single taproot. But certainly I think the Christian theological world, or the Christian theological tradition, is one of the significant roots of restorative justice. as we know it. Howard's book, Changing Lenses, draws on some quite important work that had been done by Old Testament scholars on the nature of biblical law and on the nature of covenant justice. But not a great deal had been done at that time on what the New Testament had to say about such matters. And so in Beyond Retribution, I really set out to try and supplement the Old Testament work that was covered in Changing Lenses with a fairly detailed and extended survey of New Testament text to do with crime, to do with justice, to do with punishment, divine punishment as well as human punishment, with forgiveness and with reconciliation. Howard talks in his book, and I think the most recent edition of it even has a picture of him sort of acting it out. He talks of restorative justice being a new lens, a different way of viewing the justice problem and the criminal justice problem in particular. And I think that metaphor applies to the sort of work that I've been doing in the biblical tradition as well. I found bringing a restorative justice lens, looking at fairly familiar doctrinal and ethical teaching in the New Testament, theological teaching in the New Testament, looking at it through the lens of restorative justice, looking at it in terms of the categories and the priorities and the insights of restorative justice theory, has really enabled me to see the New Testament in a new light, and I think in a very fruitful, very helpful light. Particularly, for example, on Paul's teaching on justification by faith, often regarded as the kind of central theme of Paul's theology, driving force of the Reformation. We don't often think, when we use the term justification by faith or read Paul's reflections on it, that he's using justice language, extensively using justice language. And that justice language has often been interpreted as a kind of retributive justice. Bringing restorative justice perspectives to bear on that material, I think, has helped me see that Paul's conception of justice, when he tries to explain the work of the cross, is much more a restorative conception, and the whole thing, to me, makes a great deal more sense when viewed in that light. So I found bringing restorative justice theory to the task of reading the New Testament or reading the Bible to be very fruitful, very transforming, really. On the other hand, I think that biblical teaching kind of boomerangs back as well and has something to offer restorative justice thought and practice. Maybe not completely new things, but I think helps us to see things in an even more profound way. I think the Bible's understanding of the relational character of justice, of the relational character of humanity, that we are fundamentally relational beings, and that justice applies primarily to the nature of our relationship to each other. I think the insights that the Bible has, the New Testament in particular, has into the meaning and the importance of forgiveness. Its constant emphasis on the role of grace and of humility and of generosity. Its emphasis on confession, on repentance, on atonement even. I kind of have a gut feeling that in restorative justice thinking, we need to think a little bit more about atonement for wrongdoing, and whether there is certainly an emotional need to feel that wrongdoing has been atoned for in some way, maybe a moral need as well. So I think that the Bible's recognition that there is a spirituality involved in doing justice, I think contributes to restorative justice theory. And of course, when you work with people from indigenous communities in particular, this is just standard fare for them, that doing justice has an inescapable spiritual dimension. So I found in my biblical work over the last couple of decades that there's been a very fruitful two-way traffic of ideas, which is why I use the metaphor in compassionate justice, not of a new lens, but of a dialogue, of setting up a dialogue between what the New Testament talks about and what restorative justice talks about. And like all dialogues, both sides will be affected by what the other says. So let me then just thirdly refer to the work I've done in compassionate justice. I'm sure very few of you have read the book, but maybe you will be inspired to read the book after I give you a little bit of an overview. What I do in compassionate justice is move from mapping the overall shape of New Testament teaching around issues of crime and justice and punishment and reconciliation and forgiveness and so on. Beyond retribution is a kind of overview of the whole field. What I do in compassionate justice is move to focus on just two passages. And the two passages are the two most famous parables in the Christian tradition. The parable of the prodigal son, which is found in Luke chapter 15, and the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is told in Luke 10. And I would hazard a guess that even in a fiercely secular society like our one, that if I was to go out on the streets and ask people if they'd ever heard of the prodigal son or the Good Samaritan, they would have some recognition. They might not be able to tell you the story, but they'd at least recognize the labels. I found that these two stories of Jesus are the two that have had the greatest impact on shaping the intellectual, the moral, the aesthetic, and the cultural traditions of Western civilization, especially the Good Samaritan. Somebody made the comment that the Good Samaritan has built hospitals all over the world. Its impact on Christian practice and on Christian thought in a whole range of areas has been quite extraordinary. Let me just read you a couple of paragraphs from the preface of Compassionate Justice, because it explains briefly how the book emerged and what it is trying to do. So this is just a couple of paragraphs from the beginning. When it comes to writing books, I believe in evolution rather than creation, or to be more precise and theologically sound, creation by means of evolution. This book evolved from an initial hunch that the parable of the prodigal son, which of course I knew well, but had not spent much concentrated time studying, might have something valuable to say to me as the father of two fine young adult sons, one of whom was a bit of a problem at the time. As I followed up my intuition and immersed myself in the story, I soon discovered that the parable not only deepened my appreciation of fatherhood, it also triggered a range of recognitions and responses stemming from my long involvement in the work of restorative justice. I came to see that restorative justice theory provided a helpful new lens for understanding this remarkable story, while the story in turn deepened and enriched my conception of restorative justice. My next hunch was that the same would probably apply to that other most celebrated of Jesus' parables, the parable of the Good Samaritan. Here, evolution underwent a surprising mutation as I was led into the literature of social psychology, jurisprudence, and moral philosophy. Once again, I found this rich vein of scholarship casting new light on a well-worn parable, and the parable more than returning the compliment. Evolution, as all good theists know, is not ultimately a random process. An invisible hand guides it towards some ultimate goal, some final telos, when the bloody tooth and claw of the evolutionary past and still of the present will finally make sense, or at least be swallowed up in perfect peace. Perhaps a teleological hand can be glimpsed in this present study as well. Who knows? Maybe the final outcome might even show faint signs of intelligent design. An inner coherence focused particularly on the need of compassion in the work of corrective justice. In his helpful discussion of the priority of love in the panoply of human virtues and its relationship to social justice, philosopher Timothy Jackson observes that the biblical conception of justice is so all-encompassing that it invites a story rather than a definition, poetry rather than theory, imitation rather than contemplation, metaphors and parables rather than abstract principles. The following study contains its fair share of definitions and abstract principles, but it's the parables that were most striking. The book's overriding concern is to return again and again to the stories, metaphors, and parables that Jesus told in Luke 10 and 15 to find guidance on the meaning of justice and on the need of compassion. I call this constant looping back to the parables a dialogue because dialogues are two-way conversations where each conversant is affected by what the other says. In this case, the stories of Jesus are freshly illuminated by commentary from the social sciences and legal philosophy and restorative justice, while modern justice discourse is enriched and critiqued by the parables and metaphors of Jesus. So that explains really what I try to do in the book. And when I liken it to evolution, that really was true. The book, I didn't set out with this ambition to do this. The book just emerged out of my indwelling of these parables, really. So the parable of the Good Samaritan, I suggest, affords us particular insights into victimization. The central character in the story is a crime victim. And it affords insights into the response of both the legal establishment, because the priest and the Levite in a first century community were as much connected with the operation of law as they were with the operation of the temple. They were legal specialists, so I view them from the perspective of representatives of the legal establishment, and also the response of the wider community to the needs of victims. And I suggest that this story, I guess, both encapsulates what our knowledge of traumatology and victimization tells us about what it means to be a victim, and maybe also enriches it in some way. The parable of the prodigal son in part 2 of the book focuses on the plight of offenders and on what is entailed in restoring an offender, a remorseful offender, in this case, restoring him and reintegrating him back into the community. And the parable, which is the longest of Jesus' parables, also narrates the resistance that the reintegration of the offender encounters from the older brother, who is expressly depicted in the parable as a representative of the law-abiding and economically productive community. That's how he actually describes himself in the story. In both parables, I discovered compassion figures explicitly as the crucial ingredient in the work of restorative justice. I think both parables are about the restoration of the victim, the restoration of the offender. And in both parables, at exactly halfway through both parables, the turning point occurs when the central character is moved with compassion at the suffering he witnesses and responds with a clear-sighted determination flowing from that emotional experience to restore the recipient to well-being. So in both episodes, justice entails a compassionate commitment to restoration. Justice and mercy are not arraigned in opposition to each other or in tension with each other. On the contrary, it's only through the merciful actions of key participants in the drama that justice is effective for those caught up in the tragedy and travesty of criminal offending. So justice encompasses mercy, and mercy evinces justice. I then, having noted that in the exegetical work, make this comment. Such a proposition becomes controversial, however, once we intend it as a general truth about the pursuit of justice in a complex society. It's one thing to derive personal inspiration from the way two fictional characters in two ancient folk tales respond mercifully to the predicaments they encounter. It is quite another to draw normative conclusions about the nature of justice, or to advocate an alternative paradigm for the operation of the criminal justice system on the basis of such accounts. There are major complications entailed in moving from the imaginative world of Jesus' parables to the world of normative ethics and the world of institutional practice today, and any attempt to bridge that gap must grapple with the peculiar characteristics and theological intentions of Jesus' parabolic discourse. So I'm not naive about the hermeneutical and pragmatic difficulties of taking the lesson, the emphasis of these two simple parables and transferring it into the criminal justice sphere of the mixed society today. I'm not naive about it, but undaunted, I attempt to do it in part 3 of the book, where I try to bridge that gap, at least in broad terms. I first of all, in the third part of the book, discuss the meaning of compassion and its characteristic qualities. And the definition I offer is there on the slide. Compassion is an experience of emotional pain and moral concern occasioned by the awareness of and identification with another subject's suffering or unhappiness. Now, like all carefully constructed definitions, it then invites a careful parsing of its different points, which I then do. But the point I just want to stress here is that compassion is both an emotion, it's an emotion of vicarious suffering, suffering that comes from identifying with another person's pain. It's both an emotion and a moral commitment to do something about that pain. It's not simply a feeling of overwhelming sorrow, but it's a commitment to act to relieve that pain. Now, it's the emotional nature of compassion that is both its greatest strength, because emotions, and the word emotion already implies this, emotions move us to action. We are moved by what we feel. And so the greatest strength of compassion is its capacity to motivate us to do something. But it's also its greatest weakness, because emotions are notoriously fickle and fleeting, and they are often considered to be a serious impediment to rational thought and to objective analysis. So emotions are considered to interfere with, to be problematic to the task of moral reasoning and certainly political decision making. So whilst compassion is essential to moral reasoning, because it is compassion that alerts us to the presence of a problem that needs to be dealt with, it does have certain pitfalls, it does have built-in problems. And I discuss 4 of these problems, but the most serious of the problems is the problem of partiality. This problem, which I think is intrinsic to the psychology of compassion, this problem can be explained in this way. Psychologically, we find it much easier to feel compassion for people who are most similar to ourselves, for people who resemble us in terms of background, class, nationality, race, language, culture, or religion. And I find the nightly television news the most obvious example of that, because the kind of attention that's given to other white English-speaking people who suffer is far greater than the attention that's given to non-white English-speaking people that suffer. And that's because the assumption is that people who watch the news will be more interested in the suffering of people that they can naturally identify with. So I think that's an undeniable sort of psychological, or part of the psychology of compassion, which means that if we rely solely on compassion to determine our moral duties and our action to relieve pain, if we are guided solely by compassion, we will end up with a very parochial sense of obligation. We will only feel obligated to address the needs of people that evoke compassion in us, and the people who evoke compassion in us will be the people most like ourselves. And so we'll end up by limiting our response to a very small sphere of concern. So that, I think, is a real problem. But the way to cope with that problem is not to try and filter out emotions from the task of moral reasoning, to say somehow we've just got to switch them off and just stick to the facts, because that's simply not possible. and the attempt to do it can be profoundly distorting. I think rather than doing that, what we need to do is to realize that compassion needs to be educated. It needs to be educated in the sense that it has to be combined with a moral code, with a clearly thought through value system that affirms the humanity, the equal humanity of all people, even those who are not like ourselves. And therefore that pushes us to always seek to extend the boundaries of our natural compassion, our natural empathy. Naturally, we will feel compassion for those who are closest to us or who resemble us the most. We need a kind of moral theory, if you like, and a spiritual commitment. I think this is where theology and spirituality have a crucial role to play as well. That will keep pushing us to extend those boundaries to people who are not like us, to people who are distant from us. So compassion is really important, but by itself, it's not enough. It needs to be combined with moral thought. I then move to discuss the place of compassion in public life. Compassion is a social emotion. It's something that emerges from our relationships with one another, and therefore it surely has a public, even a political significance. The level of compassion that exists in a political community is very significant, very important for the well-being of that community. And so there is, I think, vested interest, if you like, for our institutions and for our political leaders to seek to encourage a fostering of compassion in society, both in individual citizens and also in the way that our social and political structures operate in collective society. Again, how do we do that? How do we foster compassion in public life, in communal life? Well, here I draw on the work of the well-known philosopher Martha Nussbaum, who speaks about this very helpfully. And she suggests that we foster enhanced compassion in society in two ways in particular. One is through a commitment to moral and civic education. Education in the broader sense. She has a delightful discussion of the moral impact of teaching a young child the nursery rhyme, Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star. Because what the child is being encouraged to develop through a nursery like that is their capacity to imagine things beyond their own experience. And it's this ability of education to cultivate the life of the imagination, which is important for compassion, because compassion requires us to imagine ourselves into the shoes of another. And education is a way of education in the broader sense, not just formal education, but education in the way that we develop citizens at every level. And that education, if it's to be most effective, has to eventually be a kind of cross-cultural education. We have to learn how to imagine ourselves into the lives of people who are quite unlike ourselves. And literature is one way of doing that, but there are other ways of doing that as well. Education also helps us to imagine ourselves in the shoes of others who suffer from life's tragedies. We're all exposed to those tragedies as human beings. And so education that asks us to participate imaginatively in the pain of others. And she points out that there's a certain stage in human development of children when it becomes important for them to hear sad stories as well as happy stories, because it's the sad stories that enable this capacity to feel compassion for others. The other way in which we work at enhancing the levels of compassion in society is through trying to institutionalize compassionate values in the way our social and political and economic institutions operate. Now, at first glance, it seems odd to talk about institutional compassion, because compassion is a human emotion, and institutions are soulless organizations. They don't feel anything. They don't have emotions. So is it even meaningful to talk about institutionalizing compassion? Well, I think it is. I think it's perfectly intelligible to speak of institutions exercising compassion. I make the observation, if institutions can be cruel, then they certainly can be compassionate. We all know institutions can be cruel. Think of the prison system, for example. It's possible for institutions to embed the principles of cruelty and imperviousness to human suffering in the way they operate. Therefore, it must be possible for them to inculcate the principles of compassion, not by the institution itself feeling the emotion, because that obviously is not possible, but by the institution seeking to observe the principles of compassion in the way they operate. And that means being aware always of the precariousness of human existence, of the vulnerability of all human beings, of all citizens in society, this common human vulnerability to the arbitrary twists of fortune and fate. Being conscious of that and therefore seeking to develop institutions that embody a compassionate response to that in their processes, which encourage compassionate sensitivity in the staff, because these institutions operate through people. Now, the institutions are more than just a collection of people. They have their own culture and their own spirit, which in many ways affect the people, but they still involve people. And so one of the ways to develop compassionate institutions is by consciously seeking to cultivate compassionate sensitivity in the part of the staff, and having systems that allow that to occur. So I remember reading, for example, one study that showed that medical students in a hospital are far more likely to feel compassion for their patients if they have the time to engage with them. And in fact, having a system that allows the medical students to have time with the patients rather than rushing through a waiting list is more effective in producing compassion, a compassionate, empathetic response on the part of the student, than are courses in moral philosophy, for example. The system itself can produce more compassion by simply allowing time for human beings to encounter each other. And I think that that has applications to the criminal justice system and to restorative justice. So in the final chapter of the book, I look at the role of compassion in the justice system. The criminal justice system has a kind of ambiguous relationship to emotion in general and compassion in particular. On the one hand, crime almost invariably involves intense human suffering. And the trial system that we have is a system that is designed to provide a platform for this human suffering to be spoken about, even if it's only in the form of giving facts. It still attempts to recount the story of the suffering and to allocate blame and to impose sanctions on those who are responsible for it. So emotion has an obvious role to play in the criminal justice system. On the other hand, there has been in the legal world, I think, a pervasive sense that emotions are very problematic to the task of the court system, that emotions will cloud rational judgment, that emotions will lead to prejudicial outcomes. Probably the single greatest influence on the evolution of modern criminal procedure has been the desire to exclude or to moderate, at least, the distorting impact of emotion, such as sympathy, intense sympathy for the victim, on the task of legal discovery and legal decision-making. And it's not uncommon to hear judges instructing juries to sort of put their emotions aside and simply to attend to the facts that are before them, because there's a recognition that if they get carried away with too much sympathy for the parties, they will end up by reaching an unjust decision. Of course, there is no way in which we can switch emotion off like a light bulb. It's just simply not possible. And the encouragement to do so, while it's understandable, is really asking for the impossible. Human beings are intrinsically passionate as well as rational creatures, and emotions are always involved in everything that we do. And even the legal system itself gives expression to a passion for logic, a passion for evidence, a passion for rationality that is driven by any intense emotion in itself. So rather than pretending that we can somehow switch the emotions off, once again, I think it's better for us to recognize the strengths and weaknesses of emotional engagement in the criminal justice process, and particularly compassionate engagement, recognize its strengths and its weaknesses and strive to compensate for its weaknesses. The strengths, I think, have been set out, I think, very compellingly, particularly by feminist legal scholars. The strengths of empathetic engagement or compassionate engagement, its ability to give us more attentiveness to the humanity of the parties that we're dealing with, to tune into their suffering, the ability to listen more carefully, the ability to focus on the individuality of the person. All these things flow from the conscious attempt to engage empathy in the task of legal discovery and adjudication. So there are real strengths there that need to be recognized and affirmed. But there are also real dangers that need to be compensated for. One of those dangers is the possibility of projecting our own feelings onto the other parties, that we feel that what we are feeling when we have heard this terrible thing being described is the same as what the person themselves is feeling. But that might not be the case. I mean, we have a tendency to project ourselves onto others. But once again, the real danger through giving emotion free rein in the justice process is the danger of partiality. The fact that we will allow our sympathy for the victim particularly to encourage us to be even more punitive towards the offender, to be biased against the offender. And I have a discussion in the book about the tendency of victim impact statements in court to encourage that kind of emotional reaction, which intensifies the feelings of compassion for the victim. But sometimes, if that is not carefully dealt with and understood and brought to consciousness what's going on, it can end up by heaping even more blame upon the offender and wanting to be more punitive. I then finally, and I've almost finished, I then really, and this was a kind of discovery in the process of writing this chapter, I realized that the existing discussion on the role of compassion or empathy in the criminal justice system has almost exclusively focused on the need for judges and jurors, and I guess lawyers, to feel compassion for the parties in the case, and particularly compassion for the victim, or compassion, empathetic engagement for the offender, so that you try to put yourselves in the shoes of the offender and appreciate more fully what's driven the offender to commit the crime. So compassion in the existing discussion has been assumed to flow unilaterally and hierarchically, one direction from the judge or the juror toward the victim or the offender or the defendant, and hierarchically, I mean, it's handed down, if you like, by those who are empowered to make the decision. Little thought has been given in the existing literature to the need also for a horizontal and reciprocal compassion, a compassion that flows both ways and flows between the two primary parties to the event, the victim and the victimizer, the hurting person and the one who has caused the hurt, the guilty and the innocent, that there is a place surely for compassion to flow between those parties reciprocally. And I realized that this is where restorative justice has such an incredible contribution to make. It not only recognizes that compassion is essential to the task of doing justice, and I'll be interested to hear some reflections on why that's a controversial idea. But I think most restorative justice, well, maybe I'm wrong, restorative justice practitioners will recognize this, that the task of doing justice in a restorative way works because it engages the ability of the parties to feel each other's suffering, each other's pain. Not only does restorative justice recognize that, but it provides the procedural mechanism by which compassion can flow horizontally and reciprocally between the parties. It can flow in both directions. And the fact that it flows in both directions, I think, militates against the problems of projection and partiality, which are a real problem if it's just being directed from on high down towards the powerless parties in the process. That the tendency to project your own feelings onto the other person are compensated for by the fact that the other person can tell you how they feel and can respond, and there can be a dialogue about feeling. It's not simply a matter of imagination. And the problem of partiality, which is an inherent problem of compassionate engagement, is also compensated for by the restorative process, because both parties are players in the dialogue. The experience of both parties is essential to what we're doing. So I think restorative justice has a tremendous contribution to make, and advances the discussion of the role of empathy, or the role of emotion in the legal processes, I think, to a new place. I think this is a new frontier in the existing discussion. I also think that it is this element of reciprocal compassion. Now remember, by compassion, I mean the ability to identify with the suffering of another person in a morally significant way. That it's the experience of reciprocal compassion that I think accounts for the extraordinarily transformative power and potential of restorative encounters, restorative practices. Now, every facilitator knows this is not always the case, but every facilitator also has their stories, many stories to tell, of encounters between parties where hearing each other's suffering described and providing a way in which the parties can share in the pain of the other. And, you know, for me, as a New Testament scholar, I hear sort of in the back of my mind Paul's reflections on the fellowship of Christ's sufferings. You know, the Christian experience is one of a participation in the sufferings of Christ. A kind of theological echo to all this. But the experience in the restorative justice process of the two parties being able to share in the pain of the other in a morally significant way, which is the essence of compassion, is what I think promotes the experience of healing and restoration, both at an emotional level and at a sense of justice being satisfied. Because I think one of the things that satisfies justice is an awareness that the person who has triggered pain in another has not evaded that pain themselves, that they have shared in that pain to some degree. That's essentially, I think, what the justice process is about. So justice is healing in this sense. Healing in the sense that injustice creates an emotional wound that needs to be addressed, and healing in the sense that it satisfies our instinctive sense for justice as a kind of sharing in pain. Which is why I call restorative justice, from a gospel perspective, compassionate justice. Thank you.
There's a lot to think about there. We had, I'm going to, Ryan, you activate the other PowerPoint here. We have some time for questions and comments. We have several here. I have several to add to it. Ryan may have some as well. But one of the questions come in, Chris, is someone says, I am having problems with the phrase restorative punishment. What exactly do you mean by this? How can one punish without continuing the reciprocity of cycles of harm and violence?
Okay, in Beyond Retribution, I have a discussion on restorative punishment. I think the question of how punishment relates to what we do as restorative justice practitioners is an important one, and one that often comes up. I read a book recently which has given me a lot of new ideas for thinking about this in terms of restoring social trust. But I won't try and summarize that here because I haven't got it sort of summarized in my own mind. But from memory, in Beyond Retribution, the discussion of restorative punishment goes a wee bit like this. Punishment is the infliction of suffering on a person, infliction of pain, And it seems that we can't in society do without that. We seem to need to have a system in which wrongdoing is acknowledged by the infliction of some kind of punitive recompense. And I think the reason why it involves the infliction of suffering is because there is something about the injustice of offending that concerns pain. Pain is triggered in the experience of the victim. And I think social punishment is a kind of symbol of a deep moral sense that a person who inflicts pain on another must somehow participate in the experience of pain as well. They can't get off scot-free because that violates the principles of reciprocity, if you like, that hold us together as social beings. So I suggest that punishment can be understood as restorative in a couple of senses. Now, it's 10 years since I wrote that section, so I should have reread it before today. But if I remember correctly, in a couple of senses. One is in the sense that we still need a mechanism whereby the person who has done wrong experiences something of the pain that they have caused. And as much as punishment is a cause of pain, somehow we need to be able to do that. I think restorative justice provides an alternative way of doing that by setting up a meeting between the parties where the offender is confronted with the pain that they have caused and shares in it vicariously through the experience of compassion. So you could see the restorative encounter as sort of punitive. Now, it's complicated to use that kind of language, I realize, because punishment is actually the imposition of a secondary penalty rather than the penalty of the event itself. But I think you could see it as at least reaching after the same kind of reality. If punishment is simply a matter of causing pain to balance the scale of suffering and nothing more than that, then I think you do get into the situation very difficult to justify morally, which is why we have all these utilitarian theories of punishment. But I think there is a deeper truth that can be acknowledged. I think it is possible to think of punishment in a restorative way.
I have observed that when a victim and offender make an agreement for restitution, that it's important for the person who's been victimized that it be difficult, that if it's too easy, it doesn't feel satisfying. And similarly, an apology that comes too easy doesn't feel like an authentic one. So maybe whether that's punishment, I don't know. But there is a follow-up question to that particular issue, and that is, and what do you do with Jesus' teaching to turn the other cheek? How does that fit in?
Well, I think Jesus' teaching on turning the other cheek is an encouragement not to get locked into cycles of blow for blow, a kind of feuding, a sort of a response to wrongdoing by imposing a similar sense of suffering on the other person for its own sake. And I think that's where we end up in the kind of cycle of abuse. So Jesus encourages his followers at least to step out of that cycle by responding to a wrong in a restorative way, not simply in a retributive way or in an eye for an eye kind of way. I don't think. I mean, I know there is a book by a Mennonite scholar who argues really that we should be opposed to the punitive system entirely. That the logic of the gospel requires us to completely step outside of any punitive system. I'm not sure I can go there. And I think this other book that I recently read helps me to understand why we can't. Just very briefly, what he argues is that restorative justice is fundamentally about the restoration of trust. That what is lost in a criminal event is a breach of trust. Trust operates at a personal level and at a social level. So the victim needs to be able to have their trust in the offender restored by being reassured that the offender is going to take responsibility for the harm and to not repeat the harm. And I think we in the restorative justice movement have been very good at working at the level of personal justice or personal trust. But there is this other level of the fact that in community we need to be able to trust society. We need to be able to trust the community at large, that the community at large will oppose wrongdoing, that the community at large will ensure that oppression doesn't occur, that people don't get unjust advantage by criminal offending. And the public justice system, which involves punishment, is a way of needs to be able to trust society again in light of their wrongdoing. And they need to trust that society will take care of this kind of wrong in a way that benefits everybody. I mean, I'm sure your experience is similar to mine. I've done restorative justice conferences where the parties have said, I want to leave it to the court to decide what is the appropriate penalty. I don't want to take responsibility. I want the court to decide that. I'm here for a different reason. I'm here for the reason of telling my story and hearing my questions answered and so on. So I think punishment does have a role to play in the community, and as Christians, we don't need to deny that.
It must be Ross London you just read.
Yeah.
Another question that's come up here is, how does it have to do with the relationship between compassion and empathy? How does your concept occur from the essential nature of empathy?
I use empathy, compassion, sympathy, pity interchangeably. I know that a number of psychologists in particular find lines of distinction between the two, or between empathy. You could use distinctions. It's interesting in different ways. My purposes, it wasn't to make that distinction. Compassion, that's the term that the Gospels use, is the same as empathy. Empathy I think compassion perhaps has more of an activist kind of feeling to it. Empathy can be more simply, perhaps sympathy is more simply feeling the feeling, but not necessarily feeling obligated to act. But for me, they're much the same.
Or even more neurologically, I want to talk about empathy neurologically. It's a little harder to talk about compassion neurologically. But while we're talking about your definition of compassion, a question that rose for me when I saw it there was how you distinguish between the experience of vicarious victimization. When we hear a victim tell their story, we feel that, and then sometimes we can become compassionate, but other times, and many times, we try to differentiate ourselves and say, this would not happen to me. We try to ask them to push them to forgive, or we say things like, why were you out there that night, and so forth, as an effort to distance ourselves. How do you distinguish between those two? Or what makes a difference?
Yeah, I wouldn't distinguish between them. I'd say that probably that attempt to hold the person at bay and to make that distinction is an attempt to switch off the feelings that threaten to overwhelm us.
Yeah.
So people today talk about compassion fatigue, don't they? Where or people who are involved in dealing with people who are suffering a lot suffer post-traumatic stress disorder themselves, and so there's a kind of switching off that takes place. And I think that kind of reaction that hears a story of victimization and then immediately wants to try and explain it in a way that makes you feel safe. I won't suffer the same thing if I don't do the mistake that you made.
Yeah.
I think to some extent is an attempt to block the impact of compassion. So that's where I think compassion, to say that it involves moral concern, means that it's hard work on the part of the feeler. They've got to discipline their experience and to not make recourse too quickly to simplistic ways of explaining it away.
We have another question going back to the restorative punishment theme, and that is the role of incarceration in light of restorative justice and restorative punishment. Any thoughts on that?
I think incarceration should be reserved for people who are a genuine danger to others. I don't think. Now, again, these generalizations are all capable of being gainsaid. I did a conference recently with a young man who had just finished 3 years in prison for dangerous driving causing death, and it was hard to avoid the feeling that prison had been good for him. He had got off drugs. He had begun to learn a trade. He had rebuilt his relationship with his family. So, prison can be a restorative experience. I understand that for women prisoners in particular, it can be a chance to get away from violent relationships and from constant demand. So there's always going to be exceptions, but at a global level, it seems that incarceration is almost the opposite to restoration, because it is a stripping of a person's freedom. It is a restriction of their sense of responsibility and accountability. So I certainly wouldn't see prison as the best example of restorative punishment at all.
We have a number of questions coming in now. There's one about sources, but I'll come by that one later. I'm going to read this because it's a little bit complex. I am thinking about Marshall's notion of compassion and the problem of partiality. In which ways do you account for the power of social constructions of race, class, and gender to shape the ways in which we see those who are unlike us as deserving of our compassionate justice, given the ways in which these often operate in unconscious and covert ways? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
It'd be nice if you could see that, and I could send it to that.
Yeah, I think I understand what the questioner is saying, that this problem of partiality, which I think is very real, I think we can all identify with it. And it's not even just a partiality towards people who resemble us in race. We tend to be more compassionate with people that we're related to, people who are in our immediate family circle, people that we feel some sense of responsibility for, and so on. So it's not just a racial or a gender or a class issue, it's a kinship issue as well. So I think we all recognize this problem of partiality, and it's made worse by the fact that we are all affected by, and as the person rightly says, subconsciously affected by constructions of race and class and gender and so on, that exacerbates the problem of partiality. How do we overcome it? I think we only overcome these things as a lifetime journey to recognize the problem. I think it's always better to surface the problem and struggle with it than to either not be aware that it's there or to deny that it's there. And so, once we recognize the problem, we can begin to deal with it. The best antidote to those kinds of constructions that are often not very helpful in relating to people who are very different from us. I mean, the best antidote is to meet such people, isn't it? And again, I think this is where the restorative mechanism, which encourages at its best personal encounter between people who may be very different in other levels, enables an experience of the other's humanity to emerge, which can help to compensate for those cultural strips. The story of the Good Samaritan, I think, is so powerful because the hero in it acts in a way that completely contradicted the cultural stereotype that he and the listeners to the story operated with. I think it was one of the incredible dimensions of that story is the way in which it deconstructs quite deliberately those sorts of transcripts, and shows how compassionate engagement with human suffering, or focusing on suffering of another person, is the most powerful way to overcome those stereotypes.
A couple of these questions aren't getting any easier, but here's a couple more. Many times the victim may lose trust in the public justice system due to the nonchalant attitude of the primary reporting agency like the police, especially when it comes to racial discrimination and abuse. How can compassionate justice help?
Could you just read the first part again? When you turn away from the mic?
Many times, when I turn my head, it doesn't pick up quite well. My monitor is over here. Many times the victim may lose trust in the public justice system due to nonchalant attitude of reporting agencies like police, especially when it comes to racial discrimination and abuse. How can compassionate justice apply there, help there?
Gosh, I think the nonchalant attitude that let's work with the police as a kind of subculture. The nonchalance is, again, I think, a coping mechanism for holding the incredible demands of compassion at bay. And to some extent, we all have to do this. I mean, we all have to have coping mechanisms because, just as a kind of footnote, there's an interesting discussion in the book about the role of distance in moral responsibility. The famous essay written by Peter Singer back in the 1970s, which basically asked the question, if I'm morally obligated to save the child of my neighbour who's fallen into the swimming pool, Why am I not under an equal moral obligation to save a child in a distant country who's starving to death that I don't have any personal contact with? And he comes to the conclusion that from a philosophical, moral perspective, there is no way you can make that distinction, that you are under the same obligation. But of course, we can't live with that reality. And if we tried to live with that reality, if we tried to feel that we were morally obligated to address the sufferings of everybody on the planet, we would burn out very quickly and we would end up helping nobody. So we all, to greater or lesser degrees, have to channel our compassionate feelings and cope with them in a way that's manageable. And I guess our tendency is to, and certainly if you're a kind of an emotional person as I am, is to try not to feel too much. But I think within the police subculture, or perhaps within the criminal justice system generally, that nonchalance, that kind of indifference, once again, is a coping mechanism. How does compassionate justice overcome it? Well, I guess what it has to offer, the notion of compassionate justice, is that we need to constantly work at engaging the human feelings of the people who are involved in the system. And if medical students need to slow down long enough to feel compassion for their patients, then there's probably things that the police need to do to honour the kind of humanity of the people they're dealing with, and to feel compassion. No simple answers, but probably it has to start with police training and with working around police culture.
We're getting close to running out of time here. We have another really complex question that I'm not sure we'll have time to answer. We see what you think, and that is how compassion functions in sexual violence crimes of sexual violence, and what guidance the Bible provides. Anything you can say in a short form on that?
Wow. I'm having lunch today with a young man who went through a restorative justice conference where he had been responsible for committing an offence against somebody else, and he himself was offended against the child. I don't know the details, but he found this experience literally life-changing. And he's coming to tell me the story, so I might be in a better place to answer the question after lunch. But I think the principles are the same, but the complexities are greater. Yeah. So the principle is that I still think there is a place for a person who has perpetrated a sexual offence to feel compassion for the victim. And there is a place for the victim to feel compassion for the perpetrator. I think that's still part of what's required. But the complexity of the kind of offending, the sort of emotional manipulation that may have been part of it, the emotional woundedness that has occurred, makes it more challenging. Yeah. But in the book I have a discussion about why drawing. I mean, I pinch most of my ideas from other people, but drawing on the work of feminist legal scholars about empathetic deliberation, about why empathy is so important in the standard legal process. And one of the things that I discuss there is the need for compassion to be able to enter into forms of suffering that we ourselves haven't experienced, or maybe not likely to experience. The suffering of a torture victim, for example, or the suffering of a person who's been subject to genocide, caught up in acts of genocide, or the suffering of a victim of sexual offending where the woundedness is so comprehensive and touches every dimension of their being that although we will never be able to plumb the depths of that, it's only by engaging our imaginative, compassionate strength are we able to begin to appreciate that. So I think compassion still has a role to play, but we need to be highly skilled in recognizing the level of emotional abuse that may have been involved in the wrongdoing, which means that we need very skilled responses.
We have a question here about the sources, and so as we're wrapping up here and getting toward that, you want to know what the new book you're referencing. I think that was Ross London's book, but anyway, what new book you were referencing, and which Mennonite scholar were you referencing?
Oh, right. Well, I can tell you Ross London's book. I've got it right here. It's Crime, Punishment and Restorative Justice by Ross London, From the Margins to the Mainstream. So what he's arguing, he's addressing the debate, should restorative justice stay as a kind of radical alternative for a few people on the side, or should it be integrated into the mainstream system? And he's very critical of those who want to see it as an alternative system. He's actually very critical, and Howard, you've obviously read the book, of thinking of restorative justice as a new paradigm. And so there are things in the book that I'm still not sure I fully appreciate or understand or agree with, but I did find this idea of personal trust and social trust to be very, very fruitful. And as usual, fruitful for me because I see all kinds of theological echoes. The just shall live by faith. Faith is trust. There is something about trust that is so, he uses evolutionary theory and so on to explain the fundamental nature of trust in human relationships, which is fine. But I could get there from a biblical perspective as well. So this had all kinds of things that I think it would invite you to reflection. But I found his discussion of the need for victims to have a trust in society restored as well as a trust in the perpetrator at a personal level very, very helpful. And I think we as restorative justice theorists need to do more work on the level of public justice, not just at the level of private justice, which is where I think we focus on. Now, the book on the one that is completely a critique of punishment, I'm just seeing I can see it in the distance. Do you know what it is, Howard?
You think it's Changing Paradigms by Paul Redikoff?
Yep. Paul Redikoff. Yep.
Paul Redikoff, Changing Paradigms.
Yeah, I can see it over there, but I might go and get it.
And for those of you who are put off by the high price of Ross London's book, it is very high price. There's a paperback version in the works, I understand.
Okay.
I think it's probably time we begin to wrap up. Thanks, Chris, for being with us. We got a lot to think about here. For those of you who are listening, this will be recorded on the web, and you can listen to it again or recommend it to others. Any last words, Chris, before we turn it over to Sarah?
No, well, it's been wonderful to. I was a bit daunted by doing this, but I hope it's come across all right. It's certainly helpful to have a chance to sort of talk out the themes that I've worked on, and amazing to be able to have this conversation across state lines and oceans and so on. So thank you for being part of it, and thanks for the opportunity.
It is weird talking to a screen. I'm still getting used to that. You can't see the rest of the audience. Sarah's going to tell us a little bit about the upcoming webinars and so forth. So I'm going to turn it over now to Sarah Ross-Shank.
Okay, thanks for joining us. We want to invite you to join us for the upcoming webinar. Our next one is on November 13th, and that is with John Quaker about Famboul Talk in Sierra Leone, Community Transitional Justice in Sierra Leone. And on December 4th, the paradox of being an Indigenous restorative justice practitioner with Harley Eagle. And you may register for both of those at that link below. Also, for more updates from the Zehr Institute, as well as information for the upcoming webinars that will reconvene in 2014, you may register at that link to stay in touch and sign up for our electronic mailing list. We also wanted to highlight our Masters in Conflict Transformation here at the Center for Justice and Peace Building. This offers practice-based curriculum, and I'm actually a student here, and I can vouch that it is a good program. And some of the focuses are in restorative justice, psychosocial trauma, strategic peace building, community development, and organizational leadership, or you can create a combination. For more information about that, you can hit that link and either apply or find out more. And lastly, another opportunity provided from by the Center for Justice and Peace Building is STAR, which is Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience. The next one, that is level 1, is happening February 24th and 28th here in Harrisonburg, Virginia. The level 2 one will actually be coming up very soon, November 11th through 15th here in Harrisonburg, and you can register at that link.
Thank you again to all for joining us, and Chris for interrupting your morning for this. And we hope you'll join us for the rest. All of you will join us in some of the future webinars. We have 2 more this in our fall, but we will, starting in January, we'll have another series. It will start with one on attachment theory and restorative justice. There will be one on the arts, using the arts and restorative justice. So we'll be posting that in a month or so. We'll be posting that schedule. So thanks again for joining us. And Chris, have a flat white with in my honor. Will you? Remember
I will.
that.
All
right.
Do that right now.
Thank you to all.
Bye.
Good night. Bye.